Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the IPHC seminar series. We'll wait just another 2-3 minutes for the attendees who are still arriving, and we'll start shortly. Okay, I think we can start. Good morning, everyone. Again, welcome to the IPHC seminar series. My name is Basia Kutniczak, and it is really my great pleasure to introduce our today's speaker, Dan Liu. This is going to be a somewhat different to the previous seminar. Today we'll have more of an economic look at the fisheries in general. Dan has been an economist for the National Marine Fisheries Service at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center since 2003 and visiting scholar at the University of California, Davis since 2008. He is an associate editor at the Marine Resource Economics, a field journal in environmental and resource economics, and at Frontiers in Marine Science. His primary research activities involve applying non-market valuation methods to measure the demand for and value of recreational fishing opportunities and the protection of marine resources. In addition, he has studied the economic efficiency of capture market and methods for incorporating non-market values for marine resources in ecosystem-based management and coastal and marine spatial planning contexts. Me and Dan, we're also currently working on a project looking at subsistence fisheries in Alaska that involves subsistence fishing for Pacific halibut. So all related to Pacific halibut too. Dan received a master's and PhD in agriculture and resource economics from the University of California, Davis, and his dissertation research focused on using non-market valuation methods to value recreation, time, and water quality improvements at beaches in San Diego County. Please join me in welcoming Dan to the IPH seminar series. I am really excited about having him, so I'm really looking forward to his talk, Non-Market Valuation and Recreational Fishing, the what, why, and how. Then we'll start in a moment, but before that, just a few housekeeping notes. In the software here, you have a window that says chat. Please type your questions in the chat box during the presentation or after. I will ask them to answer those questions after the presentation. So I will be moderating that later on. And now I think we can start, and Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Basha, and good morning, everyone. I appreciate the kind introduction you gave me, Basha, and I know that you don't often have economists or social scientists speak as part of this series, so I do feel honored to have been asked to give this talk. The focus of my talk is going to, as Basha said, talk about non-market valuation and how it can be used to understand the demand for and economic value of recreational fishing, particularly halibut sport fishing. And I'll be drawing from some of my research in that area to provide some examples. Some of the aims of my talk are to highlight why non-market valuation and the values that are derived from the methods can be important, and to describe and illustrate the methods that we use to value recreational fishing, again, kind of drawing from some of my own research, and to identify some of the challenges and opportunities in relation to the use and the methods involved in non-market valuation. So let's start with a definition for what is this thing. Non-market valuation is a subfield of environmental and resource economics that's concerned with understanding and measuring the demand for and value of goods and services that are not traded in explicit markets. So the values associated with these goods and services are often called non-market values. Some examples of non-market goods and services include environmental quality, like air quality and water quality, threatened and endangered species protection, a variety of different ecosystem services, excluding the ones that have explicit markets associated with them, such as seafood and minerals and other materials that that, say, oceans provide. But it does include some of those cultural ecosystem services like recreational experiences, which of course are the focus today in talking about sport fishing. So what makes recreational fishing and non-market good? Well, it's really an absence of a full market and a full price signal for the recreational fishing experience, because one can think that the recreational fishing experience is the price of providing that recreational fishing experience is more than just any of the market prices that one might pay, such as charter fees. It's also going to cost you time. You could be spending your time in other activities, and so there's an opportunity, a cost associated with that needs to be incorporated into that full accounting of the price of that experience to you, as well as potentially a lot of other things that you would need to purchase in order to engage in recreational fishing. By the way, that drawing is pretty much the limits of my graphic design abilities, and it doesn't get any better than that in the presentation, so my apologies. So non-market values are like other economic values in that they're inherently anthropocentric and instrumental, in that something is only valuable insofar as it contributes to human well-being, or what economists like to call utility. So utility, I'll talk about a fair bit, or mention a fair bit. It's referring to a level of well-being or satisfaction associated with something. Typically, non-market values are measures of willingness to pay. If you ever took economics in high school or in college, you'll remember that downward sloping demand curve that's shown here. The area underneath that demand curve out to some quantity represents the willingness to pay for that amount of good. And so that's often what is the target of these valuation approaches, is trying to get a measure of that. Another type of non-market value that is often derived using the methods involve or are economic surplus measures, and that can be thought about as net willingness to pay. It's in the context of recreational fishing, it's the value above and beyond what you actually paid that you would still be willing to pay in order to have that recreational fishing experience. And I should mention, although it's less applicable for recreational fishing as a non-market good, but there are some non-market goods and services that have what are called non-use values. One often hears the term total economic value when it comes to non-market goods and services, and that's really just a sum of all the use and non-use related values that people place on that good or service. Non-use values occur in particular for things like threatened and endangered species protection, where people have a willingness to pay for protecting species that sometimes they've never heard of, that never will see in their lifetimes, but they want to make sure that that species continues to exist or is available for future generations to be able to enjoy or have around. So those are kind of examples of non-use values that could exist, but again, less so for recreational fishing, which is believed to largely or exclusively be use-related values. So what kinds of things do we want to value about recreational fishing? Well, obviously, fishing trip values are a central objective to understand. But fishing trip values they capture a lot of why people value a fishing trip. It's more than just the fish that are caught, because we see people go out and get skunked and they still enjoy themselves. So they still have some positive willingness to pay for the trip, yet they're not catching any fish. So there's a number of different factors that would influence the value of a fishing trip to people. And a review that was done by Len Hunt and some co-authors in 2019 looked at the range of variables that researchers try to incorporate into models that try to capture recreational fishing decisions and model them. And they came up or identified catch-related variables as an obvious type of variable to include, things like catch rates, harvest rates, the type of species you're fishing for, cost-related things like those travel expenditures that I mentioned earlier, as well as time costs. Environmental quality could relate to air quality, water quality, aesthetics of the fishing locations where you're fishing, nearby amenities to where you're fishing, having lodging and restaurants nearby where you're going fishing are valuable to some people in some contexts. Regulations could affect the value of a fishing trip with catch rates, bag limits, size limits, gear restrictions, etc. And then congestion. Some people really enjoy having time alone on the water or fishing and don't really appreciate it when it's really crowded. So it's often these things that affect or make up the fishing trip experience that are of interest to analysts, to fishery managers, and to researchers. So let's step back for a second and just talk a little bit about some of the motivations for why one cares generally about non-market goods and services and their values. Well, one of the classic motivations for why we should care comes from benefit cost analysis. In federal regulatory analyses, we're often required to account for and measure the benefits and make sure that they outweigh the cost before undertaking federal actions. And when you're doing those kinds of benefit cost analyses and you're ignoring some potentially important values that are associated with environmental or natural resources, then you would end up with some biased evaluations of the ratio of benefits to costs. Natural resource damage assessment is another very common area where non-market valuation is fairly central. The Exxon Valdez oil spill, when that occurred, a number of non-market valuation economists were hired to use non-market valuation to value the resources that were damaged as part of that spill, including lost recreational fishing days and lost wildlife such as seabirds and marine mammals. Another reason why non-market valuation could be important is to raise public awareness. It can be used to measure economic values associated with a broad range of aspects of the environment or nature, and that can be used to kind of highlight how important those things are to people, and then used by NGOs or other advocates to lobby decision makers for funding to protect those things, for instance. Some other more recent motivations include environmental economic accounting. At the UN, they've been looking at ways of incorporating measures of natural capital and ecosystem services in their system of national accounts, and have identified some non-market valuation techniques to be used in those contexts. And then non-market valuation can be really important in trying to determine what the appropriate level of payments should be in payments for ecosystem services programs. In general, non-market valuation can also be really important generally for being able to help inform trade-offs. As we're kind of moving towards more ecosystem-based management approaches, which involve expanding what's considered part of the system and understanding how the different parts interact and are affected by perturbations in those systems, the idea of doing quantitative trade-off analysis is something that is going to increasingly gain attention, and it's facilitated by having elements of the system be measured or in a common metric, in this case, money. A little closer to home in terms of fisheries management, non-market valuation models are models of behavior, of human behavior generally, and they can be incorporated into management strategy evaluation models, which many are starting to be these coupled human and natural systems models used to evaluate management decisions, and the incorporation into those frameworks is an area that is already being done, but certainly could expand. And then these non-market valuation models can also be used to help inform economic impacts. And that's exemplified in some work that I've done with Chang Sung, my colleague at the Alaska Center, to combine a recreational behavioral model with an economic impact model to understand how harvest regulation changes might impact the economy. And then finally, fishery sectoral allocations can be helped with non-market valuation information. Economic theory does suggest that the economically efficient allocation between different fishing sectors is the one where the marginal net value of a fish is equal across the sectors. And that means that you would need to calculate the marginal value of a fish in the commercial sector, and one can do that using something like the quota lease prices. But then you also need to value it in other sectors like the recreational sector, where you would need to use non-market valuation. Okay, so let's turn to some of the actual methods. There are a variety of different non-market valuation methods, and they come in there's two broad classes. The first is what's called revealed preference methods, and the other is stated preference methods. Revealed preference methods use data and information on what people do through observations of or observed behavior to inform their underlying preferences, values, and demand for a non-market good or service. On the other hand, stated preference methods rely on carefully constructed questions that are usually asked in a survey or an interview in order to have to provide information about the underlying preferences that people have and their values. So it relies on what people say. Of these methods that are, or of the revealed preference methods, the travel cost method is the most common one used to value recreation. I won't really be talking about the hedonic method much or at all. And then for stated preference methods, I'll be talking a bit about choice experiments, but I'll mention the other ones shortly. But let's first turn to the revealed preference method. I just mentioned the travel cost method, which is motivated by the idea that costs can act as a proxy for the price of a recreational experience. And I've already kind of motivated that earlier in the talk. But this approach generally involves modeling fishing decisions to understand the underlying demand and value. Some of those margins of choice that are modeled within a travel cost model, or also known as a recreation demand model, is whether or not to fish, where to fish, how many fishing trips do you take over some period of time, like a season or over a year? How long do you fish on a trip? Those are all margins of choice that can and are analyzed within these models. And typically, at least in modern analyses, the data that we use is individual level, and we have to collect that using usually angler surveys. These models, these travel cost models, tend to be really useful when we're trying to understand the value of fishing trips and try to understand how that value changes with different factors that might affect that choice. So in a site choice model where we're modeling where people choose to go fishing, we might be interested in understanding the impact of harvest rates. And in order to gain some insights about that, their choice of where they go fishing provides you some information about what, how much they value the harvest rates as they differ across different sites. But it does rely on there being that existing variation between, in this case, sites, in order to be able to derive how that affects the individual's choice. Some examples of some studies that have actually used travel cost models to value halibut include some studies in Alaska from basically using data from the early 1990s, actually. Both in the Berman and Kim and Carson et al. Papers were using data from surveys that were done in the early 1990s to value aspects of sport fishing, including halibut fishing. And then the Barrientos paper is a report that was recently done that applies a fairly simple travel cost model to value California halibut fishing trips in California. So a lot of those margins of choice that I showed you on the last slide are discrete in nature. Do you fish or not? Which of these 7 sites do you choose to fish at? They can be analyzed within a framework that's called the random utility maximization model. It's a type of discrete choice model that's commonly used both in the to model recreational demand, like those decisions I just mentioned, but it can also be used to analyze some data from some of the stated preference approaches that I'll mention later. Under the RUM model approach, there's some assumptions. The first is that each alternative that is being considered has a level of utility to the individual. That utility level is the sum of 2 parts: a deterministic component, which we can model based on observed information on the attributes of the choice, the things that describe the choice, and individual characteristics about the individual. And then a second component, which is an error term. For the researcher, it's what we can't observe. It's the unobservables, and it's treated as an idiosyncratic error. And different assumptions about that error term, that EEJ, lead to different types of RUM models. And you probably heard of the Logic model and the Probit model. Those all can be derived within this context. Under the RUM model or RUM theory, individuals will choose the alternative that yields the largest utility to them. Okay, so let's shift gears to the stated preference methods, and then I'll get into some examples. There's 3 main types of stated preference methods: contingent valuation, which involves asking people questions that more or less directly or indirectly reveal their willingness to pay for something. They can be as simple as, are you willing to pay X dollars for this good? Yes or no? And their response would give you an idea of whether or not their true willingness to pay is above or below that X dollars. Contingent behavior involves asking people questions to gauge whether and how their behavior might be different if some attribute of the recreational trip changes. So in the context that we live in now with rising gas prices, we might be very interested in asking people or knowing whether or not the number of trips that they plan to take this coming summer is different from the number they took last summer under current gas prices. So framing a question in that context would help you understand whether or not people plan on taking the same number of trips or not, and the role of gas prices. Choice experiments are a little bit more complex in that they ask people to choose between multiple alternatives that differ in the characteristics that describe those alternatives. And I'll just show you an example of one that I'll talk about from my own research. This is a very simple choice experiment setup where people are asked to choose between alternatives A, B, and C. A and B are fishing trip options that differ in the fish that are targeted, the bag limits associated with that trip, and choice C is basically doing something else, not doing saltwater fishing for those species. People are asked to choose which of these options they prefer the best, and then we can analyze this using row models. There are a number of studies that try to value halibut fishing using this approach. This includes work that Leif Anderson and Todd Lee have done up in Washington and Oregon, and then some work that Keith Criddle has and Todd Lee did a number of years ago in Alaska, as well as some of my own research with Doug Larson. I would be remiss if I didn't mention kind of the elephant in the room in regards to stated preference methods. They do rely on data that on what people say in order to infer their underlying values. And there are a number of critics that argue that people don't answer stated preference questions consistently with how they actually would in real circumstances. This is the idea of hypothetical bias. Kathy Kling and some co-authors did a very thorough evaluation of the 40+ years of methodological and experimental research that looked into kind of aspects of the validity of the stated preference approach. And they ended up concluding that stated preference methods appear to pass these validity tests when best practices are followed. And that really put an onus on researchers in the field to come up with a comprehensive list of best practices that can be used to basically mitigate that hypothetical bias and provide valid information. And so a group of top economists that work in this field came up with a list of 23 best practices guidelines that cover the full range from cradle to grave of the research process involved in conducting a stated preference study, from developing a survey and implementing that survey and framing the stated preference questions, all the way to analysis, testing of validity, and reporting and archiving of the data. Turning now to my own research, I've collected a fair bit of revealed preference and stated preference data through a series of mail surveys of Alaska anglers over the years, starting in 2007 and then again in 2012, and the most recent one was in 2017. Each of these kind of data collections involved targeting, getting information from 3 distinct angler populations: non-Alaska resident anglers, basically people who live outside of Alaska but who fish there, Southeast Alaska resident anglers, and all other Alaskan resident anglers. And the reason that I was interested in collecting or having 3 different versions of the survey administered to each of these populations is because the nature of both the opportunities and the profile of the fishing that are done by those different groups is really different. and that need to be accounted for in how I structured the survey. Again, I did this via mail survey, but people were contacted both over mail and by telephone in the process of administering the survey to generate the most response. In terms of reveal preference data that's collected, a fair bit of information on what fishing they did, where they went, how often they went, what they fished for, harvest levels. There was some detailed trip level information asked about the most recent trip in some cases, including how much they spent on the trip, from travel costs to time on site. And then in terms of the state of preference data, I already showed you an example of one of the choice experiment questions, and that came from the Southeast Alaska version of the survey. And it came from the most recent survey application, which was 2017. And the ones that I'll show you are really focused on trying to understand the effects from harvest regulations on fishing behavior. Okay, turning first to an analysis of the reveal preference data, basically a travel cost model. This is a RUM model of fishing site choice and participation, which we model over the course of the season, and we incorporate and try to account for targeting behavior. This particular paper in 2011 used data from the 2007 survey, and one of the downfalls of that was that we didn't have significant parameters on the halibut harvest rate parameters. So the model itself ended up being one that really relied on variations in Pacific salmon harvest rates. And so it was really a salmon model of fishing behavior. But from that, we were able to generate estimates of the overall value of fishing to an angler over the course of a season, and that ended up being about $2,200 to the mean angler. And these are unguided fishing trips, by the way, they're not charter trips. So I wanted to update the 2011 study with the more recent data, 2017, and kind of include some additional bells and whistles, which were not in the 2011 study. And here, the utility, like before, is assumed to depend upon the travel costs, both time costs and money costs, as well as harvest rates. Here we include halibut, chinook, coho, lingcod, and rockfish, whereas the earlier study had only looked at halibut, chinook, and coho. And then we also try to control for site-specific fixed effects, which kind of absorb a lot of the other characteristics of sites that might vary, that are not harvest rates. So just in terms of what I've been able to find so far, this is ongoing work. But one of the things that was interesting is that, like the 2011 study, I found that gender matters in fishing participation. So people or males tend to participate in fishing more than females. But an interesting point is that, unlike the 2011 study, other demographics did not seem to play much of a role. So in the earlier study, we found an effect from household size and age as well, but not here. The economic values were lower in this particular model. Not sure why yet. It could be that the earlier model had some omitted variable bias. We weren't accounting for those site-specific fixed effects, and that could have played a role in biasing the estimates of the model, the earlier model, but something I'm looking into. But we were able to estimate the effect of changing halibut harvest rates, and found that if you increase halibut harvest rates by 50% from, on average, about 0.49 fish per day, up 50% more than that, that would be worth about $1.16 per trip per angler. Over the course of a season, that roughly translates to an additional $50 to $60 per angler for the fishing, additional fishing value. Turning to the stated preference analysis, again, you've seen this. It's a simple choice experiment asking people to choose between different unguided private boat fishing trips. I won't dwell on it, but I will kind of point to the fact that underlying what trip options are actually shown to individuals is this experimental design. We systematically vary the levels that are seen by people based on a statistically based design of combinations of these different levels for each of the attributes in order to get the most information about their underlying preferences. And this resulted in using a fairly large number of versions, 20 versions that each had 4 choice questions in each of those versions of the survey. One of the issues I wanted to analyze or assess this time around was the role of what's called attribute non-attendance. And this is the behavior of people ignoring some of the information provided in choice experiments. And this is an issue that has come up a fair bit in the recent literature for choice experiments. But the basic idea is that the standard assumption is that people, when they answer these questions, use all the information. They don't ignore anything. They fully consider all the information before they make their decisions. But Herbert Simon in the 1950s proposed that based on what has been found in the psychology experiments and observed behavior up to that point, that people sometimes don't seem to do that. They seem to have they make bounded rational choices in that he proposed that there was a limited ability to fully process and utilize all the information provided to people when making certain types of choices. And this often leads to using choice heuristics or rules of thumb in order to simplify the choice-making process. And that's a coping strategy for some people who are confronted with complex choices. And attribute non-attendance is a form of choice heuristic, where in the choice experiments in particular, we're looking at the idea of people ignoring one or more of the attributes that are presented to them. And John Whitehead and I have a special issue of Marine Resource Economics that dives into this issue. And as part of our introduction to that issue, we did a small meta-analysis to look at the existing literature to see if accounting for attribute non-attendance actually plays much of a role. And we found that ignoring attribute non-attendance does lead to an upward bias in willingness to pay. And in a review paper, we do recommend that testing for attribute non-attendance in all choice experiment studies should be done as a best practice. So that's kind of motivating why I did this. Why might we actually think attribute non-attendance could arise in recreational fishing choice experiments? Well, sometimes, and not in the example I showed you, but sometimes there could be a lot of attributes. There could be 6, 7, 8 attributes that people are asked to trade off, and that can lead to a very complex choice environment for some people who may not want to expend all of the mental energy to actually go through that. And not everyone has experience or preference for all the species that might be asked about in these choice experiments. And so they can certainly ignore the species in some cases. Fishing costs may not be binding for some people's choices. I've interviewed a number of anglers over the years and heard that they're going to fish no matter how much it costs. And so if they're ignoring costs, that's important to account for. And then for species that are not actually going to be targeted, that they don't care about, they also might then not care so much about the regulations or catch information that's provided as part of the choice experiment either. So there's a lot of reasons to believe that attribute non-attendance could arise, and it's worth investigating, or at least in my mind it is. So I estimate 3 different models. The number one is the standard model that ignores attribute non-attendance, and the other 2 account for attribute non-attendance in different ways. I won't go into the details of that, but the models themselves led to fairly unsurprising results in some ways in terms of how bag limits affect people's utility. As you increase the bag limits, people's utility or well-being goes up. That's not surprising, but it goes up at a decreasing rate. Does seem to be a quadratic relationship between bag limits and utility. And then, of course, if trips cost more, then people get less or get lower utility. Not surprising, expected by utility or by economic theory anyway. But the fit statistics do suggest that the attribute non-attendance models do fit the data better than the standard model, and that those models do indicate that the cost attribute is actually ignored a fair bit of the time, over 50%. And that has an effect on welfare, on the economic values that are derived. And you can just look at the halibut value here, which represents going from 0 fish in the bag limit to 1 fish, which is in the standard model valued at about $95, but it's less than 50% of that in the attribute non-attendance models. So you really do kind of mitigate, or there are some strong effects from accounting for attribute non-attendance here. John Whitehead and I did a recent study in 2020 that looked at trying to combine the reveal preference and stated preference data from an earlier survey, from the 2007 survey, to kind of use the strengths of both types of data in generating estimates of value. Reveal preference data, like the travel cost data, those are really useful for nailing down the role of cost on people's decisions. But so that's a good strength of the reveal preference data. That the stated preference data we have concerns about, especially in light of what I just showed you in terms of attribute non-attendance. The stated preference data, on the other hand, are really useful when we're interested in understanding the effects of policy variables that may not have that variation in observed behavior, like changing bag limits to new bag limit sizes that don't exist. And so that is actually a real strong case for why use stated preference. So we combined the data in a model and found that there are statistical gains in the resulting model, as well as it did tend to lead to economic values that were between those for the reveal preference only and stated preference only models. But we did actually highlight a number of some of the challenges to combining the data sets, which I won't go into details of, but I'll kind of mention it does relate to relating the cost attribute in the stated preference data to the reveal preference or travel cost model treatment of the cost term. That and a few other things. But let me end with, or I will end with talking about a number of challenges and opportunities related to the data collection, methodology, and usage of non-market valuation. In terms of data collection, as I've pointed out, a lot of these methods require we conduct surveys. Response rates for surveys using traditional survey methodologies like mail surveys and telephone surveys, those response rates have declined a lot over time. And they seem to continue to decline. People are less willing to participate in surveys than they were in the past. And this puts a real onus on researchers to try to assess and control for differences between the samples that they get, which might have a really low response rate, and the population, to make sure that there aren't any biases in their sample, such as if there are differences between the people who respond and those who don't respond, that can result in a non-response bias associated with your sample. This also does point to a need to perhaps kind of change with the times and get on board with web-based surveys, trying to get access to fishing apps or use fishing apps to collect data from anglers, perhaps looking at big data sources like social media, But there's a lot of concerns that researchers should have with using some of these approaches, and that is that the data you get might not be representative or collected in a way that allows you to make inferences about the population, because a lot of the data one gets out of these approaches would be basically fall under the category of convenience samples, because they weren't drawn randomly, for example, from the population of interest. And so there could be some sample representativeness issues. But there needs to be more comparisons of traditional methods to these other approaches in the fisheries or angler survey world, because there really haven't been that many, or if any. I'm not aware of any. And also, I should point out that non-market values do change over time as demographics and people's preferences for things change. And so that basically provides an argument for needing to do these surveys on a regular basis and generating estimates of value fairly regularly. But we know that surveys like these are time and money costly, especially when you're trying to follow some of those best practices that I talked about earlier, including doing a lot of qualitative pre-testing like focus groups and interviews and pilot studies. That all adds up in terms of time and money. And within NOAA, we don't have regular funding sources for non-market valuation data collection like these angler surveys. That's why the last survey was actually done in 2017. And we're working under an environment where NOAA's overall budget is not really increasing, labor costs are going up, and research funds seem to be going down. So it's very challenging. In addition to that, there are some administrative speed bumps for doing survey work in the federal government, including that the U.S. Office of Management and Budget does as part of the Paperwork Reduction Act requirements. They have to review all the survey work that's done, and that can add anywhere from 6 to 24 months of time to the overall research project timing. In terms of methodology, I see a lot of opportunities. I do see a lot of hope in combining reveal preference and state of preference data into combined models like the work with John Whitehead. I mentioned, though, that there are some issues that need to be resolved with how to more consistently treat the cost component of those models. And then Paul Hinesley and John Whitehead have a recent paper that tried to account for attribute non-attendance in one of these joint models, and I see that as an area where more research is needed as well. In addition, in terms of reveal preference models, expanding the margins of choice that we actually analyze would really help to provide more accurate information about behavior and underlying values. To date, the treatment of trip duration, or how much time to spend on site, has been fairly simplistic in their treatments, and doing a better job of kind of accounting for endogenous trip duration seems like a fruitful avenue, as well as understanding more about on the water fishing decisions, and finally there's value that is perhaps not being measured, that people place on the ability to fish, that can be derived from analyzing people's decision about where they choose to live. Some people will choose to live in places where they have fishing opportunities or like to fish, and that's kind of burned into their decision of where they choose to live. But we're not really understanding any of those things right now without looking at that margin of choice. And then a recent paper I did with some of my NOAA colleagues looked at the adherence to those best practices I talked about earlier in state of preference studies that valued marine and coastal resources, like, and that included recreational fishing. And we found that recreational focused state of preference studies didn't adhere to the best practices as well as some of the other studies did. So I think that in general, those best practices, well, we should try our best to adhere to those best practices a bit better in this area. And then also there seems to be a lot of reliance on choice experiments, including in my own work, but turning to contingent behavior questions could afford us an opportunity to get questions that are closer to real choices and that would enhance the validity of our results. In terms of the use of non-market values, well, these studies I've kind of emphasized can take a long time. They can be expensive, and this means that often decision makers, analysts need to turn to the existing literature to see what has been done because they can't afford to do a new study. This is the area of what's called benefits transfer or environmental value transfer, and these are methods for applying existing economic values and value functions to new applications. But the proper way of transferring values that kind of ensures validity does require a fair bit of expert guidance, and so that's a challenge in these contexts. I also wanted to point out that, and I mentioned this earlier, that there's kind of an increased usage of non-market valuation within management strategy evaluation models, and I list 3 studies here that basically integrate models of recreational fishing behavior with a stock dynamics model in order to evaluate different harvest regulation changes. And these are all studies that were done on the East Coast, and they all use state of preference choice experiments to kind of act as the recreational fishing behavioral model. But as I've shown you, there's some gains to using RPSP models, and so that's something that I'm looking at with Russell Dame, a PhD candidate at Oregon State, and David Kling, a professor there, on some work that we're trying to do with an integrated model for Pacific halibut. Just to wrap up, non-market valuation does provide a set of tools for understanding the demand and value of recreational fishing and the factors that affect it. As we do move towards EVM approaches, non-market valuation and information it provides can help facilitate trade-off analyses and be incorporated in management models. But due to limited funding, costs, timing, and technical challenges, efforts should be made to assess the priorities for non-market value information that are most important for policy management and to explore ways of using technology to facilitate access to high-quality data. And finally, researchers should continue efforts to improve methodologies to provide more accurate estimates and helpful behavioral models within all of those contexts. So I think with that, I will just end by saying thanks to all my collaborators in the research I mentioned, as well as to all the supporters within NIMS who have provided a lot of support over the years. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That was great overview of non-market valuation approaches. Something we don't hear probably as much as we should within this context of fisheries focus, particularly on the biological aspect. But it's a great food for thought when thinking about the move towards more wholesome approach to fisheries management that is taking into consideration various aspects of the fisheries, including more of this socioeconomics components and the people interested in fishing just for the sake of fishing, not necessarily for this kind of direct benefits incorporated into the landing values. Let me see. We are still waiting for questions from the audience. Please feel free to write them in the chat box, and I will be bringing them to them to answer. And I hope to hear more from the audience. But in the meantime, I have a couple, so I might as well start. Then maybe you could tell us a little bit more on how to account in non-market valuation studies for size measures. As you know, that Pacific halibut, particularly in Alaska, it's subject to various its back limits, but also size limits and various other measures. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more how this could be incorporated into understanding the value of a fishery, considering various scenarios in terms of the size measures, especially thinking about that there might be various types of users of the fishery, some that might be interested in bigger fish, and that's the strategy, but there might be those who value the conservational aspect of such management measures, believing that it might be adding to stock sustainability over time.
That's a really great question, Basha, and I appreciate it. The state of preference example that I provided was a simple one in that it focused on unguided angler trips rather than the charter anglers, who there admittedly aren't many in Southeast Alaska among residents anyway, but in analyzing some of the data from the non-resident anglers, their choice experiments do have other aspects, including size limits in the choice experiment setup. And so from those choice experiments, I am able to estimate kind of the trade-offs and marginal values associated with changes in size limits. And let's see, I think it's there's a paper that Doug and I have in Marine Policy in 2015. I think that one uses data from the 2012 survey where we started to incorporate that attribute of size limits there. There are some limitations in the choice experiment setup for collecting data on certain aspects of kind of the regulatory environment. For instance, day of the week restrictions wouldn't fit into the current setup for those questions because we're asking people to choose between trips at a certain choice occasion where those trips are possible. So it's unclear how, say, a day of the week restriction would enter into that as an attribute. But certainly, I think that's something that I'm thinking about as I move forward, because as those restrictions may become more of a concern in terms of the number of days of the week and timing of those that are being considered.
Thanks. How about the different types of users, those who might be interested in the conservational aspect of the management measures versus would you separate these in or ask this as an attribute variable?
Yeah, you can. So including individual level interactions with some of those attributes that are in the model. For instance, if we were able to identify through questions in the survey, people who indicate and that they prefer catch and release fishing, we can interact that with the harvest bag limit variable to distinguish them from other anglers. So there are ways to put in interactions that relate to the individual within these RUM models to kind of tease out the differences between different types of people. We can do that within the model, or we can separate the sample into different groups and analyze them all separately to generate these results, assuming, of course, that we have enough sample to do that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's great. I'm trying to look at the questions from the audience now. First one is about getting a copy of the presentations. I would just mention that we will be providing the presentation through our website. So soon after that we are finished, this will be available for anybody interested, both the copy of the presentation and the recording. Then we have the question from Peter de Grief, one of our commissioners. Could commercial fisheries have a market and non-market components to them?
That's a good question. I think potentially the question of whether or not, say, there's a value to working waterfronts has been looked at in a study, a recent study whose authors I don't remember, but the idea being that people who are not part of the fishery might still value having that working waterfront, the fishing, the fishermen and the docks and all the activity there as a and they could and because they're not participants in the fishery, but rather tourists. I think in this case they're tourists. Then the measurement of their value for preserving that aspect of that fishing community was something that was being measured, basically as a non-market value. But I think we largely do focus on understanding kind of the market-related values associated with commercial fisheries. But Alan Haney and I have had conversations about this issue in the past about, like, is there a non-market value to preserving the coastal community fishing culture? And I think that's where largely you would guess that there would be some non-market value.
Great, thanks, Dan. Another question from Pat Ahern. Have there been choice attribute experiments measuring size limit values versus bag limit values, number of fish that can be retained? Also interested in how one approaches spatial bias. For example, when offering choice attributes, anglers might not fully appreciate attributes or specific spatial fisheries.
In terms of the first question, there are some choice experiment studies that have incorporated not just harvest regulations like I showed you, but also expected catch levels. And one can derive from those choice experiments kind of values for retention, as well as kind of release. And I think some studies out of the Southeast, David Carter, I believe, and Christopher Lise have some a paper that does this, as well as I think my 2007 survey and the papers that came out of that look at some of these aspects as well. Could you repeat the spatial aspects?
Sure.
The second part. Okay.
How one approaches spatial bias. For example, when offering choice attributes, anglers might not fully appreciate attributes of specific spatial fisheries. Not specific, I guess, sites in this case.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I think that it points to the fact that the choice experiments I showed you are fairly generic in terms of they're not naming a site. There are other characteristics that are unaccounted for or have to be assumed to be the same between the choices, which is kind of the standard approach to doing them. But I know of, at least not within fisheries, but in other areas, some people have tried to incorporate and name sites as part of those choice experiments, so that people had more concrete ideas and about like the other characteristics that are not in those choice experiments in the information provided to them that they can kind of use from their own experience. But yeah, I'm not quite sure. Well, I'm also not sure if I answer that question.
I think it must be also a little bit about there might be different preferences in terms of what is the favorable site versus in terms of different attributes or not, right? And that might be personal preferences related to that.
Yeah, and we of course can try to do that. I mean, similar to the my response to your question earlier about individual level preferences and the heterogeneity that people have for things. We model that in the model, in these RUM models often, and you know, because we know that people have different preferences. There are some people who really like certain types of fishing for some types of fish, and other people who really hate it. You know, and that includes halibut. I've heard people who love fishing for halibut because they're great to eat, and they just enjoy pulling it up from the bottom. And other people who say they don't fight enough. It's super boring. And we have to account for all of that within the model and we do by allowing for there to be kind of underlying preference variation. And we can do that likewise with characteristics of the individual, like I said earlier, both in terms of their attitudes, underlying attitudes, as well as demographics. And we can do that at the attribute level as well, so that there's variation in how people value each of the attributes.
Thank you, Dan. There's a follow-up comment on that. For example, we have, it says the person who asked the question saying Copper River salmon versus other locations is an example of a spatial bias. Not sure how we design surveys to avoid this kind of spatial bias.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? It was Copper River salmon and what?
Copper River versus other locations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's, yeah, I think that's potentially a overall research design question. If people believe that Copper River, and there are reasons to, that the Copper River salmon fishing is distinct from other Alaska fishing, then one could certainly design the survey and the questions accordingly to distinguish between Copper River salmon fishing and other areas. But that could potentially just be a larger research design issue rather than specific to a given choice experiment question or travel cost model.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for following up. Thank you, Pat, also for this question, the follow-up. We're some minutes after our time, so let's not compete with the lunch, I guess, but I couldn't finish without saying thank you for including Pacific halibut in your fancy drawing in one of the slides, Dan. That was great. While the fisherman looked a little bit clunky, the halibut looked great. So.
Well, you're welcome. I did my best, and that truly was my best. But thank you very much for again for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to give this talk. I appreciate talking to all of you.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us and bringing us this little bit different perspective on looking at fisheries and recreational fisheries here, and how we can consider their value, not in terms of just benefits to businesses, but in terms of this more value to the people and this no market valuation methods. I really appreciate. As I mentioned, the seminar recording will be available on our website. So anybody who missed it or would like to go back to any specific details, please check on our website and go through that. I'm sure if you have any additional questions or follow-up, you can reach out to Dan or let me know, and I will try to get you an answer if you have any follow-up. I appreciate you all joining today, and that was a great before lunch just learning experience. Thank you.